Hello everyone, welcome to Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Steven Yissil, and today we are doing a new deep dive series. We will first be looking into this book called Flickering Empire by Michael Glover Smith and Adam Selzer, and we have 3 chapters in part 1 from this book that we'll be reading, but I do also have a few photos to show as we read along. It's a very general introduction here to the Chicago film industry in the 1900s. We're going to be going back a little bit before the 1900s as well. But, yeah, here's today's thumbnail. And, please like and subscribe, comment. That all helps with what I'm doing here. And, yeah, every little bit helps. So, we do have a few pictures today. Mostly they're, Thomas Edison and some lithographs of the World's Fair. This one is, I believe, Wabash in 1907. But yeah, we'll be starting shortly. Now, the subheading of this book says how Chicago invented the U.S. film industry. Now, this book is also loosely narrated, like it's they take real life situations and they put a little narrative spin on it. So it's a little different from what I've been reading here. But hey Jason, how's it going? I see you in the chat there. Yeah, we'll be getting started shortly here. So there are 3 chapters to this part 1, but what I want to do today is just try to get through chapter 1. There is a preface, and there's a lot of information here. So, yeah, I guess we'll get started. Oh yeah, Jason. I'm gonna have to look a little more into that. Perhaps we'll find out during this reading. But yeah, Jason says a lot changed for Chicago film when we got the tax break. Yeah, there's a lot of elements here. As you can see on screen right now, Thomas Edison invented the 35mm film camera, motion picture camera. And I guess a little background on him. He was born in Ohio. Eventually, he was working on the East Coast, and then he came back for the World's Fair in 1893. And yeah, we'll be getting into all of that. So, right now, before part one of this book, which is titled Thomas Edison, Invention and the Dawn of a New Chicago, there is a preface here that says Hollywood before Hollywood. And I guess we'll read that. There's a photo here as well. I'll show that on screen when we get to it. But yeah, we'll start with the preface. So, Hollywood before Hollywood. The story of how Chicago served as the unlikely capital of motion picture production in the United States during the earliest days of cinema has become curiously forgotten in academic circles and in popular fandom alike. Most film history and textbooks describe how early American film production developed in the 1890s and early 1900s in New York and New Jersey, the home of the Edison Manufacturing Company and the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company. It has become commonplace for film historians to juxtapose this narrative with the story of how the movies then moved to Hollywood in the second decade of the 20th century. This version of history completely ignores the story of film production in the Midwest. Chicago, when it is discussed at all, is often treated as an afterthought or a footnote. David Bordwell, in Kristen Thompson's otherwise excellent and authoritative Film History and Introduction, for instance, devotes exactly one sentence to major Chicago movie studios like the Selig Polyscope Company and the S&A Film Manufacturing Company before noting that, quote, poor weather, end quote, eventually caused film producers to move farther west. So we got a big problem here already. There's a giant narrative right now, and we just addressed it in this opening statement here, in this preface, that we have an entire film industry that is never talked about. And in fact, if I recall correctly, that book that they mentioned, Film History and Introduction, that was something given to college students such as myself at Columbia College Chicago to read. And for it to have one sentence, that's an embarrassment. Especially being in Chicago. A film school in Chicago provides a book that has one sentence about Chicago film history. So we already know something's up here. And I think a lot of what we're going to find out soon is this man, Thomas Edison, has been given a very bad rap in the history books. But thankfully, we have Michael Glover Smith and Adam Selzer for Flickering Empire, this book they put together. Now, this hardcover, I looked it up during my research for doing this part one. This hardcover book goes for $80 on Amazon. I think a little more than that. So the paperback version is about $25 if anybody wants to go pick this up for themselves. Yeah, you know, Jason says that everything shuts down into winter still in Chicago. Yeah, and construction, for example. There's a lot of projects, multiple projects on bridges, on the facades of buildings. they just kind of come to a stop during this time. But they always choose to tear up the roads around this time too when the ground is frozen. Yeah, so film history and introduction. I'm pretty sure I have that book somewhere, and if I can dig it out, I'll show it on here on one of the next lives. But yeah, already we are shown that what our next generations are being taught is that Chicago was no more than a footnote in film history. But we will see that the reality is clearly otherwise. But let's continue here. The astonishing reality is that Chicago filmmakers produced literally thousands of movies between 1896 and 2018. Thousands of movies between 1896 and 1918. Perhaps more than any other single city in the country during this time. So I'll read that one more time because that's a very profound sentence there. The astonishing reality is that Chicago filmmakers produced literally thousands of movies between 1896 and 1918, perhaps more than any other single city in the country during this time. It has been estimated that the Chicago film industry, at its most prolific, at the end of the first decade of the 20th century, was responsible for producing the majority of the American movies on the market. Among the major Chicago players were S&A, Selig Polyscope, and Klein Company, a distributor that also dabbled in production. Not to mention a copious number of independent production companies, including the American Film Manufacturing Company, the Birth of a Race Photoplay Company, the Ebony Film Company, the Foster Photoplay Company, the Historical Feature Film Company, the Myco Book and Film Company, the Peter P. Jones Film Company, and the Unique Film Company. Major studios based in other cities, such as Edison, Biograph, and the American Vitagraph Company, also maintained Chicago offices. Hey, Woo Rider, I see you out there. Yes, and Woo, we're going to be questioning a lot of what many consider resets. I don't know if any of you out there have been following Archaic's channel on YouTube as of recently, but he's diving into the books and finding evidence going against major resets, like cataclysmic resets. And I'll say this much for this portion here. What we're going to look into is documented with architecture, the architects, the people that are involved. That's what we'll be talking about here. But don't get me wrong, I've done a lot of looking into all of the mud flood stuff and the resets, but I do feel that it's becoming a little too crowded talking about all that stuff, and we're starting to lump everything together into like all of this mud flood theories talk. It distracts from talking about this stuff like I'm talking about today with the film industry just rising up in Chicago during this time in the late 1890s through the late 1910s. And I guess, like, when I'm focusing on this stuff, it's because these people lived during this time. There's personal accounts, there's records going into different systems like the museum where a lot of this information was obtained for this book. Several museums actually. It all helped put the factual evidence down on paper. So like I really like seeing these older maps, which I think we'll see a few of them through this read through. And I do have some other Daniel Burnham maps, which is an architect that was front loaded for the World's Fair project. And I guess a fun fact about that is Burnham was tasked to complete it in 1892. And as you know, the Chicago World's Fair took place in 1893. And just like today, but in a much different, I guess, working conditions, context. Like, we don't know, like, their access to resources, building materials. These buildings were put up with paper mache. And this is knowledge I took from my own research. They used wood and they used paper mache. And that's for a majority of the buildings, apparently. But during this fair, Thomas Edison was a major part in having electricity for the fair. They had electricity at night. And yes, Tesla was his student. And one of the major narratives is that Tesla had his ideas stolen from him by Edison. And that kind of muddies the whole topic of Edison inventing the motion picture film camera. Kind of takes credibility away from Edison, I'd say. Just the way everything's been presented with that. Oh, that's pretty cool, Jason. Uh, One of my commenters here, Jason, said he had his friends and family were in the Edison Chicago office, and they have handwritten notes from Edison. Yeah, like I said, like all of this stuff is going to be so important going forward because of like the different AI image processors that can make all of these photos of people and architecture. Like we have all of this documentation going back and back and back, but we have to protect it. You can put it in books because the original source, like museums, some of them could have fires, floods. So it's always good to continue to spread the information around. And that's also why I feel comfortable reading from this book, but also talking with all of you. Because, like, knowledge is meant to be shared. And so here I am sharing what I know with you and also reading along for you, with you. And we're all learning something here today. But yeah, a lot of independent film companies were here at the time. And I'll continue on with the preface. But Jason asked when we reversed the river. I'm not certain on the year, but it was dredging that reversed the river. And it was, I think, mostly like people were polluting the Chicago River, and it was all going into the suburbs and whatnot. So now all the flow goes the other way. I'll have to look. I'll make a note of that, and I'll bring it up on the next show that we do. Okay, so I'm going to continue with the preface here. The enormous empire employed thousands of men and women in a thriving industry that can accurately be described as, quote, Hollywood before Hollywood, end quote. The biggest of the studios owned lots that comprised entire city blocks, and they released locally shot movies on a weekly basis. So, again, just to put this into perspective, you have these reels of film which could not be shown in direct sunlight or daylight before being developed. They needed to have processing companies, or they could do it themselves, but develop that film. For you to turn around films on a weekly basis like that, you would need some sort of industrial complex if you want to get thousands of movies out between 2 decades here. And with the resources available, it makes sense that they would have all of these offices here in Chicago being the hub of a lot of the words are on the tip of my tongue. Just the commerce aspect of Chicago invited all of this over here. But okay, let's continue. Their output totaled hundreds of films every year. Colonel William Selig became known as, quote, the man who invented Hollywood, end quote, as a result of his opening the first permanent movie studio in Los Angeles in 1909. But this happened only after he had already produced hundreds of films at his successful Chicago-based studio during the previous 10 years. So that's someone else we're going to have to look into. Colonel William Selig. And that was in LA in 1909. See, there's a bigger story here with a connection of Edison and Hollywood, and how Edison directly influenced Hollywood's existence here. Alright, so let's continue. Among the thousands of movies produced in Chicago during this era, the early Chicago filmmakers claim many famous firsts, including the first Suedo documentary and the first use of special effects or miniatures, and that is from Edward Amet and George Spoor's Spanish-American War movies of 1898. The first industrial films made for a corporate client, Selig Polyscope's movies for the meat-packing giant Armour and Company, 1901. The first Wizard of Oz films, Selig's Polyscope's The Fairy Log and Radio Plays, 1908, and The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, 1910. Many pioneering westerns, including the first movie about Jesse James, which is SNA's The James Boys in Missouri from 1908. The first American film version of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, that was SNA's A Christmas Carol in 1908. The first movie adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is also probably the first American horror film, and that was made by Selig Polyscopes, or it was titled Selig Polyscopes, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1908. The first biographical picture about a U.S. president, SNA's The Life of Abraham Lincoln from 1908. The first two-reeler, Selig Polyscopes, Damon and Pythias, 1909. And the first slapstick comedy to feature the famous, quote, pie in the face, end quote, pie in the face gag was SNA's Mr. Flip from 1909. Got a few more firsts here. This is a long list, but we're getting through the whole thing. It's only half a page left. The motion picture debut of Western superstar Tom Mix, Selig Polyscopes, The Cowboy Millionaire from 1909. The first film directed by an African American, the Foster Photoplay Company's independently produced short The Railroad Porter from 1912. The first American, quote, cliffhanger, end quote, serial, Selig Polyscopes, The Adventures of Kathleen from 1913. The first successful weekly newsreel, The Hearst Selig News Pictorial from 1915. The first feature-length movie to showcase Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's beloved Sherlock Holmes character, SNA's Sherlock Holmes from 1916. And the first feature film directed by an African American, the Peter P. Jones Film Company's independently produced The Slacker from 1917. So that's a lot of pop culture that was conceived in Chicago. At least documented down onto motion picture format. Very interesting. So the slapstick also, you know, when I think of old slapstick, it's the Three Stooges. Or, Groucho Marx, right? But no, we had Wizard of Oz, we had Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Biography about Abraham Lincoln. These things should be common knowledge, but they're not. But that's why we're talking about them today. Alright, we'll continue with the preface here. We got about 2 pages left. In addition to its invaluable contributions to early motion picture production in the United States, Chicago was also an important center for film distribution and exhibition. Carl Laemmle, who would go on to found Universal Studios, got his start as an exhibitor when he opened a Nickelodeon in the Second City in 1906. George Klein, the most successful American importer and distributor of European movies in the early 20th century, had his headquarters in Chicago. That's another name that we shouldn't just quickly go by. So we're going to look into all of these guys. And I really would have appreciated if Columbia College didn't have us focus on movies from 5 to 10 years prior to when we started attending there. Like having us study American Beauty. Was that really necessary? Knowing what that film is about. But we'll find out who George Klein is. But I think some of us already have an idea. All right, I'm going to continue here. The success of these and other distributors and exhibitors benefited the local production studios and vice versa. The first issue of the trade publication Show World in June 1907 claimed, quote, Chicago leads the world in the rental of moving picture films and in the general patronage of the motion view. End quote. This claim was backed up 2 months later by a Billboard article that stated that Chicago companies had commanded an incredible 2/3 of the American motion picture rental business in the early part of the year. And that's in 1907. There are amazing stories from this era that have been buried by the passage of time, and many undoubtedly great Chicago movies have been lost forever because the nitrate film stock has melted down for its silver content. How messed up is that? That's almost... No, that's as stupid as NASA saying we can't go back to the moon because they got rid of all their knowledge on how to do it. Which I'm sure some of you have seen that video. I'll reread this blasphemous sentence here. There are amazing stories from this era that have been buried by the passage of time, and many undoubtedly great Chicago movies have been lost forever because the nitrate film stock was melted down for its silver content. Do you know how little silver is on a piece of film? I don't even know what to say about that. So, silver nitrate. The trace mineral of silver. If like you'd have to melt down an entire film studio to get like an ounce of silver. Like that's how little silver would be in there. You'd have so much more slag from the plastic of the film reels themselves. Like it doesn't even make sense. That doesn't make any sense. Now, I know that a lot of these films were lost because of poor storage conditions, so you have these reels of film in really cold, really hot temperatures year in, year out. These films start just degrading. Like the film gets brittle. There's also warping that can occur, which will also make it brittle. But melting down film for the silver content that doesn't make any sense to me. I'm sorry. All right, we're moving on. Fewer than 1% of Selig Polyscope's movies still exist. You know how crazy that is to think about? fewer than 1% of Selig Polyscope's movies still exist. And SNA's Outpost has fared only marginally better, a circumstance that partly accounts for Chicago's neglected status in various film histories. Yeah. Film historian Susan Dole refers to Chicago's history as the original Hollywood. Or let me reread that. Film historian Susan Dole refers to Chicago's film history as the original Hollywood, as Chicago's best kept secret. This book, the first ever devoted solely to the rise and fall of the major Chicago studios, is an attempt to help redress the balance and to bring home to bring some of these forgotten stories to light. For unlike many of the movies themselves, the stories do survive. There are endless humorous anecdotes about the era, filmmakers being arrested while shooting a bank robbery scene, battles with censors, all-night parties with stars, wild excess, and, in the case of short-term Chicago resident Charlie Chaplin, extreme thrift. All right. There were dreamers who made bad decisions, crooks who changed the world, artists with unstoppable visions, and goofballs who happened to be in the right place at the right time. So again, this book is going to start jumping into a more narrative structure, but I'll be taking breaks here and there to share my thoughts with what we're covering. The north side of Chicago was a prototype Beverly Hills, where stars would gather at the Green Mill Gardens nightclub, later a favorite of Al Capone, to see and be seen. Francis X, Bushman, the first true matinee idol, and a future star of the original epic production of Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ from 1925, would cruise through town in a purple limousine with a spotlight on the dashboard so that everyone could see him. So yeah, a bunch of narcissists. How surprising. No, but these are the types of things I would love to have had some like video footage of, because they're already into motion picture. Like, why not film this guy like in his limousine driving around? It'd be kind of cool to have, just to back up this already documented event here. Alright, continuing on. In 1910, there was plenty of local acting talent from which the Chicago filmmakers could choose to populate their movies. The city's enormous theater industry employed about 4,000 actors and 3,500 vaudevillains. In an era when it was believed that a steady supply of fresh faces was good for the industry, many of these performers appeared before motion picture cameras. Still, other non-professionals were plucked off the street and became unlikely stars. Romola Ramos, an 8-year-old girl, was cast by the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Chicagoan L. Frank Baum, to play Dorothy in the first of the Oz movies. She stayed home from school to earn $5 per day for the role. A young Gloria Swanson used her connections, her aunt was a nanny, and for the infant daughter of SNA co-founder Gilbert M. Anderson, to get a tour of SNA studios. Swanson was hired as an extra, and she hoped to earn enough money to buy a dill pickle at the drugstore afterwards. She was thrilled to find that her pay, $3.25 for an hour's work, was enough to buy all the dill pickles she could ever want. She eventually became one of Hollywood's most glamorous stars, acting in some of the most famous and infamous movies of the silent era. The Chicago studios would also serve as a launching pad for the careers of many other stars and behind-the-scenes players. Actors such as Tom Mix, Wallace Beery, and Gilbert Anderson himself, performing under his cowboy moniker Bronco Billy Anderson, as well as screenwriters such as journalist Ring Lardner, humorist George Ade, the future directing great Alan Dwan, and Luella Parsons, who would become a future Hollywood gossip columnist and feared power broker. The story of early film production in Chicago is also a story with uncanny parallels to that of the early 21st century. The concerns about patents, intellectual property, piracy, and big business that drove the creation of early movies continue to resonate with us in the digital age today. The Faustian bargain that the Chicago studios engaged in with Thomas Edison and his famous trust, which would ultimately be responsible for bringing about their downfall, serves as a cautionary tale for contemporary movie studios with business practices likewise teeter dangerously close to the monopolistic. Above all, though, it is a quintessential Chicago story about three visionaries, the larger-than-life figures of Colonel William N. Seelig, Gilbert M. Bronco Billy Anderson, and George K. Spoor. These pioneers were the ones most responsible for building the film empire in Chicago, helping to turn motion pictures from a vaudeville novelty into an artistic medium that would define the 20th century more than any other. For a brief period, these men would rise like titans, and then, as the world changed around them, crumble back into dust. So there's one photograph here in the preface. It says filming an SNA Western indoors. So this is going to be a little difficult. Alright. So you can see the studio lights at the top up there, and everyone gathered around below. And eventually we'll get into more of the other, like as we get closer toward the mid-century stuff with Orson Welles, I'll get into more detail about the use of backgrounds and how not only Orson Welles, but like we have Stanley Kubrick, who designed a special type of backdrop for his movies. And I'd like to talk about all that too. So we'll get there. All right, so that's everything for the preface. And now we'll officially begin chapter 1. And again, this part 1 is titled Thomas Edison, Invention, and the Dawn of a New Chicago. And we got a picture of Thomas Edison and the phonograph from 1878. And it says photo is courtesy of the Library of Congress. So, take a look at that. And again, that's 1878. So, Chapter 1. Edison's kinetoscope. Kinetoscope. So, Edison's kinetoscope and pre-motion picture entertainment. The late 19th century was an era of astounding innovation. Photography was still relatively new, as were the railroads. Steam and electricity were just beginning to show what they could do. Being able to send messages hundreds of miles instantly via the telegraph was exciting, but in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell eclipsed the telegraph and stunned the world with the introduction of his, quote, electrical speaking telephone, unquote. People had known about electricity for decades, but only now were they starting to see for themselves its awesome possibilities. In many ways, motion pictures would be the climax of this flurry of invention. Although Chicago may not have been the center of the film world in the very beginning, two factors guaranteed that it would become just that in the decade prior to the rise of Hollywood: the Columbian Exposition of 1893, and the megalomania of Thomas Alva Edison. Even in this age of invention, Edison stood out. A self-educated young man from Port Huron, Michigan, Edison wore long lab coats, often caked in mud and grime, in an age when most scientists still dressed to the nines. He slept only 2 or 3 hours at a time, and not always at night. He would simply go to sleep whenever he was too exhausted to continue working. So intense was his work ethic that his wife would have to leave scraps of food around his laboratory in places where he was likely to bump into them if she wanted him to eat at all. Quote, "He is a strange chap, this Edison," end quote, wrote a correspondent for the Chicago Daily Tribune. Quote, "He has more peculiarities to the square inch than any man in America," end quote. Upon his death, the Serbian inventor Nikola Tesla, a one-time Edison assistant, said that his former boss had, quote, lived in utter disregard of most of the elementary rules of hygiene, end quote. The phonograph, introduced in 1877, was the first of Edison's inventions to truly capture the public's imagination, and it made the inventor a star. Prior to the phonograph, when a famous singer died, the sound of the singer's voice could never be heard again. Great orator skills died with them. There was no record, other than written transcripts, of any speech, conversation, performance, song, event, or indeed any other noise that had happened in the past. The fact that sound was ephemeral, man, I'm not doing good on these words today, sorry. The fact that the sound was ephemeral, as the wind that carried it had been true for the whole of human existence. When Edison casually announced that he could record, store, and play back a human voice, the public was awestruck. The phonograph seemed so wondrous that prominent magicians came to Edison's lab planning to debunk the invention, confident that he was really just a ventriloquist. Edison's staff played a trick on one, rigging the phonograph with a, quote, matrix, end quote, that had been pre-made so that when the magician had read some scripture into the machine, then tried to play it back, the voice emerging from the loudspeakers said, quote, louder, old pudding head, end quote. This is like some early trolling going on here. Reporters began to descend on Edison's lab in droves, fascinated by the unkempt inventor. A New York Sun reporter said, quote, he looked like anything but a professor and reminded me of a boy apprentice to an iron molder. His hands were grimy with soot and oil. His straight, dark hair stood 9 ways from Sunday, but the fire of genius shone in his keen gray eyes, end quote. Since the reporter had never seen the phonograph at work, Edison eagerly demonstrated, turning the crank and reciting into the microphone, Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go, to go, to go. Oh, 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 ah, cock-a-doodle-doo, doo-wah. Tucka, 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 tucka. Edison then gleefully laughed as he played it back, first at the normal speed, then comically faster and slower to the amazed reporter, whose headline simply consisted of one word, quote, marvelous, end quote. So think about that for a second. Not only did Edison have recording down to a T, he also had the ability to change the speed of it and show off even further after showing that he could actually record. So that's like a double whammy to me. I like that. That's pretty cool. Edison was quick to see how much could be done with the machine. Songs, speeches, and sounds could be recorded and copied. A statue in a wax museum could play the voice of the character it imitated if a matrix were placed inside. Dolls could be made to recite nursery rhymes. Poor churches, Edison said, could have the greatest preachers of the era recite their sermons every Sunday. Young couples could dance to waltz music long after the local dance hall closed. Recordings of arias, speeches, and even full orchestras could be sold for $5 apiece. Reading now about his performances for reporters, for they certainly were performances, part of Edison's shameless and brilliant self-promotion. It seems almost as if Edison were predicting what the 20th century would be like. In hindsight, his talk about the possibilities of recorded sound make him seem as if he were a psychic describing Watergate. Quote, I could fix a machine in a wall, end quote, he said. Quote, and by resonation, any conversation in a room could be recorded. Political secrets and the machinations of Wall Street pools might be brought to light, and the account charged to the devil. Kind parents could lie in bed and hear all the spoony courtship of their daughters and lovers, end quote. Having made the recordings, Edison had even devised a means to play them back loud enough so that they could be heard distinctly at a distance of 4 miles. Ships' captains could communicate directly with each other. Trains could announce themselves and where they were going. So I want to go back real quick because that made me pause. Where Edison says, I could fix a machine in a wall, and by resonation, any conversation in a room could be recorded. Edison knew how to do this back then. And then he was able to project sound 4 miles. Quote, why? Unquote, he said. Quote, I could put a metal diaphragm in the mouth of the goddess of liberty that the Frenchmen are going to put up on Bedloe's Island that would make her talk so loud that she could be heard by every soul on Manhattan Island. End quote. The public could only read in amazement. This was a man who could make statues talk. He seemed not only to have imagined a futuristic world far more advanced than anything conceived of in the works of the writers of, quote, scientific romance, end quote, as science fiction was then called, but also to know exactly how to make it all come true. Ideas seemed to burst forth through his very ears. All of these accomplishments, keep in mind, happened before he invented the first practical light bulb or started building the power stations that would bring electricity to ordinary people for the first time. When talking about the possibilities of the phonograph in 1878, an invention that he would continue to refine for years to come, he came tantalizingly close to describing the advent of television and talking movies before anyone had ever seen a silent motion picture at all. Quote, a man in Europe has invented a machine that takes instantaneous photographs, end quote, he said, his voice sparkling with excitement. Quote, let us suppose that he photographs Dr. E.H. Chapin every second, and we take down his sermon on the matrix of the phonograph. The pictures and gestures of the orator, as well as his voice, could be exactly reproduced, and the eyes and ears of the audience, charmed by the voice and manner of the speaker, whole dramas and operas can be produced in private parlors, end quote. It was not, however, Edison who invented the movies. Indeed, it could be argued that Edison never truly invented anything in his life other than the larger-than-life inventor's persona that reporters found so fascinating. Yeah, I'm going to tend to disagree with that one, to say he didn't invent anything. This persona also fascinated many of the budding movie pioneers, including Edward Amet, who created a primitive film projector by combining Edison's kinetoscope with a magic lantern. In Chicago, Amet and his business partner George Spohr, along with their movie-producing rival William Selig, would in many ways invent the, quote, film industry, end quote. So yeah, like I suspected too, based off of my previous research into all of this, several people were playing around with the idea of capturing motion picture on a physical device. But I really want. I guess we could compare this to. I guess there's a phenomenon, like with people running the quarter mile in record time, and nobody could do like a sub 4 minute mile, and then finally someone did do one, and then that record was broken again, like very shortly after the initial. And the same can be said for deadlifting. The first deadlift of 1,000 pounds was that record was then broken like very shortly afterward. So it's I guess what I'm trying to get at here is once the idea of motion pictures was possible, you had several people working around the clock trying to create these visions of what they could do with motion picture. So Edward Ahmet, Edison, George Spoor, William Selig. So those four people, and we also have these film distributors too to go over. So we'll be talking more about these people in the following parts of this deep dive. But for today, this is just us getting introduced to everything possible and then scaling it back as we move along. Alright, so we got those three guys. So I'll do some more research into them as well. And hi, Big Island Beach. I see you there. All right. All right, we've been doing this an hour. I think I can finish chapter 1 for today. Because you see, with me also sharing my thoughts in between reading, it's now making these videos longer. So, I'll continue reading, and yeah, we'll be finished for today soon. But thanks for being here. And if you haven't liked the video yet, please do. If you're not following already, please subscribe. And yeah, share around and comment. All of that helps with the algorithm. I really appreciate it. Alright, so continuing on. Chicago is where so many innovations began, where concepts of moving pictures and their possibilities came together. It happened a few clicks at a time. The Columbian Exposition, the massive World's Fair that put Chicago on the map in 1893, was originally planned by Edison to be the event that would introduce the movies to the world. See how important this is? Moving pictures, albeit not in projected form, had already existed for some time by 1878, when Edison began teasing reporters about the idea. Throughout the 1860s, various mechanisms that made a series of images appear to be a single moving image, such as the zoetrope, were marketed. And in 1877, the photographer Edward Muybridge, the, quote, man of Europe, end quote, of whom Edison spoke, took a series of, quote, instant, unquote, photographs to settle a bet as to whether all four hooves of a racehorse were ever off the ground simultaneously when the horse was in full gallop. The answer was yes. And that's a story that I remember very clearly. I even believe there was one of those at the zoo. One of the first zoetropes that I saw. But anything with museum, like, it's a good thing to have in a photograph museum. Because that definitely stuck with me. So let's continue here. Spurred on by his success, Muybridge went to work using instant photographs to study bodies in motion. When viewed in quick succession, these photographs appeared to come to life. From the photos, he found that many long-held notions about what humans and animals look like in mid-motion, as shown in countless works of art, were dead wrong. However, Muybridge seemed to have lacked the foresight to understand the wide-ranging possibilities of moving pictures. From all available evidence, it would seem that he was interested in the technology only as a form of studying motion and advancing science, not as a way to amuse people or create art. One would think it must have occurred to him that many studies he made of nude women walking downstairs, picking up jugs, and jumping on one foot had broad appeal outside the scientific community, but he certainly never tried to market any of his moving pictures as entertainment. Muybridge's photographs, however, were typically captured by a series of 24 cameras set up in a row, were not originally seen by the public as motion pictures. Instead, they were printed onto glass plates that were shown one at a time in slideshows. In 1882, the French scientist Etienne Jules Marie improved upon Muybridge's breakthrough by inventing a chronophotographic gun, a single camera that could take 12 photographs every second on a strip of flexible film. This was the prototype movie camera that Edison would modify and ultimately patent as his own. So I guess that's where the controversy begins here. So we'll look into Muybridge too. So let's just assume that Thomas Edison stole this man's work. Let's just assume that he did that, okay? Edison still had that larger. And I don't know. I don't know why I'm coming to the defense of Edison right now. Because you shouldn't really steal the ideas. We need to know what he modified on Muybridge's camera. That's the first thing we need to learn. And I'll report what I come back with here next week. But from what I understand, Muybridge wasn't going to promote his work and apply himself to the World's Fair like Edison did. Does that make sense? I don't know. For some of you out there should understand what I'm trying to get at. But no, I'm not coming to defense of Edison stealing ideas. But let's continue here. Edison's work on the phonograph and possibly the adding of moving pictures to his recorded sounds floundered, as did his work on nearly every other invention that he dangled at this time in front of breathless reporters. Despite his around-the-clock work ethic, he found it always difficult to keep his attention on any given project long enough to perfect it. See, that's a shame. Like, you wish that you'd have time to do everything you want to do. And obviously, being somebody like Edison, you run into problems like that, where you begin to stretch yourself out so thin around everything, and you just start having no time for anything. So you can see this was happening with Edison too at the time. So let's continue here. By 1888, when he finally got around to working on motion pictures in earnest, Edison was a fabulously wealthy man. His progress on the light bulb had been eagerly watched by newspaper reporters and his rivals, and his efforts to build power stations in every major city to supply electricity to the buildings and streets had made him a household name. In 1889, Paris staged its Exposition Universelle, a World's Fair to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. By the way, thank you in the chat, Woo. I appreciate you sharing how this is going for you. But we have another World's Fair here that I'm going to have to look into. So I've already done my research on Chicago's 1893 World's Fair and Nashville's 1897. And 1889 is one I have not looked at yet. So yeah, 1889, Paris stages Exposition Universelle. The fair was a huge accomplishment, featuring hundreds of new buildings and crowned by the enormous Eiffel Tower. See that? The countries from all over the world sent their finest technological innovations and works of art, but America, by many accounts, stole the show. Quote, Buffalo Bill, end quote, Cody and Annie Oakley played their Wild West show to packed houses, and Thomas Edison was given an acre of space to showcase 493 of his inventions. It was during the exposition that Edison came to be seen not only as the greatest inventor of the age, but also as a symbol for American individuality and ingenuity, an image that he carefully honed. So again, there's 493 inventions made by Thomas Edison at the time of 1889, 4 years before the Chicago World's Fair, where he planned to showcase motion pictures. Before that, he had 493 other inventions. So you can't say he stole all of those. But anyways, I'm going to continue here. Equally well crafted were his modesty and embarrassment at the honors bestowed upon him. When he attended a gala performance of an opera in Paris, the orchestra played the Star Spangled Banner as he entered the box. Quote, whereupon, end quote, he said, quote, I was very much embarrassed, end quote. At the end of the exposition, he was made a commander of the Legion of Honor and given a diamond-studded emblem. Publicly, he modestly stated, quote, they tried to put a sash on me, but I could not stand for that, end quote. Privately, though, he stated that the Parisians had, quote, upped my ante, end quote. He emerged from Paris as an international star, the master of electricity, the very symbol of everything that was good and right about the United States of America, a country that was transforming from its image as an odd, dangerously progressive, experimental nation, and, since the 1860s, an experiment that had gone awry, into one of the leading nations of the world, a bastion of creativity and innovation that the, quote, old world, end quote, could not match. A darker side of Edison, however, was also emerging. Although they did not bother people much at the time, stories of how Edison treated his staff were occasionally alarming. He was notorious for taking personal credit for work done by his employees and for working the men an almost inhumane number of hours. His top staff was known, for obvious reasons, as, quote, the Insomnia Squad, end quote. Edison brushed off these criticisms, and so did many of his loyal employees. Quote, I hear men tell of playing poker for 40 hours at a stretch, end quote. One staff member said. Quote, well, experimenting has the same fascination for us as poker has for others, end quote. To be sure, there was a lot of experimenting to be done. Edison's often repeated maxim that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration was one by which he lived. For every idea, he would order every possible experiment to be done, preferring trial and error to mathematics or, quote, book learning, end quote, an attitude that was a holdover from his own nearly complete lack of formal education. Nikola Tesla, then a young Edison employee, found it exasperating, describing Edison as, quote, inefficient in the extreme. Just a little theory and calculation would have saved him 90% of the labor, end quote. Tesla was a genius in his own right. Many believe that he far surpassed Edison in his abilities as a scientist. For his part, Edison simply did not understand the importance of treating his top talent well, a problem that would plague him later, along with many of the other pioneers of the movie industry. When Tesla began work as an electrical engineer, Edison told him, perhaps with a chuckle in his voice, that if he could improve upon the Edison Company's direct current brand of electricity, there was $50,000 in it for him. When Tesla did improve the brand, he expected to be paid. Perhaps he should have realized that Edison's offer was a joke. $50,000 amounted to more than 50 years of his $18 per week salary. Perhaps he should have realized that when Edison offered instead to raise his salary more than 30% to a raise of 25 per week, he was actually being rather generous. Edison, however, certainly could have handled the situation better too. When Tesla confronted him, Edison's reply was, quote, "Tesla, you don't understand our American humor," end quote. Tesla promptly resigned his position and spent a few months as a ditch digger before being snapped up by Westinghouse Electric Company, with whom he developed alternating current electricity. The innovation would become the greatest rival for Edison's direct current, and it would eventually overtake it. Edison was always vulnerable to having innovations overtaken by more creative rivals. He was often able, however, to retain the credit for himself. The same sleight of hand would occur with the movies. Wow. So Westinghouse Electric Company is who picked up Tesla, Nikola Tesla, to work. And then ended up becoming Edison's top rival. Alright, so we have a picture here of Thomas Edison and most of his Orange, Massachusetts laboratory staff from 1893. And the photo is from the Library of Commerce, or the Library of Congress. I'll fix this for the next time. If I go in any closer, I start hitting the microphone. So. Hey, thank you, Jay. Very cool, Woo. I appreciate you guys spend time here and enjoy listening to me present. I really appreciate that. Alright, so we have just a few pages left for chapter 1. And a picture of Nikola Tesla. So we'll be getting to that shortly, so I'll continue here. The idea of marrying moving images with recorded sound stayed with Edison, and so he bought some of Muybridge's instant photographs and told the Insomnia Squad to get to work. Edison and his crew knew that a series of slightly different images that passed by the eye quickly enough would appear to be a single moving picture, but synchronizing it to a phonograph recording proved difficult. Edison wanted to imprint instant photographs on a spinning cylinder, but his crew estimated that thousands of images would be required to create a moving picture that would be worthwhile to view. More than would fit on any cylinder then in existence. Edison seemed to lose interest in the project personally, but he recruited William Kennedy Laurel Dixon, a Scottish-English immigrant and his company's official photographer, to develop the optical and photographic aspects of the invention, while he himself focused on the electromechanical side. Dixon knew that the Eastman Kodak Company had recently developed a new celluloid film stock that could be rolled up, as opposed to the then common sheets, making it possible to take images more rapidly than ever before. Attendee Jules Mary's prototypical camera had never been able to take more than 40 photographs at a time. So those are some really high thresholds there. So Edison Jules Mary's prototypical camera could take up to 40 photographs at a time. And then I believe when they first got motion pictures successfully working, it was at 18 frames a second. Then they eventually changed it to 24 and then 30. And 60 just looks jarring, and I don't ever want to see that again after I saw it on The Hobbit. But 24 frames a second is enough to where it gives a very cinematic look. 18 frames a second looks too fast, in my opinion. Alright, continuing on here. Dixon ordered some of Eastman Kodak's films, experimented for a few months, and devised a new camera, the kinetograph, that drew the roll of film across the lens by using tooth sprocket wheels that grabbed the perforated edges along both sides of the film frame. The kinetograph was the first motion picture camera to utilize the soon-to-be standard and by now familiar-looking perforated rolls of 35mm film. Once the camera was in working order, Dixon and the crew began working on an exhibition device that came to be known as the kinetoscope, a wooden box that contained a 50-foot loop of film that could be rolled by an electric motor. Viewers could put a nickel in a slot. Right from the first, the devices were designed to make money. Bend over and peer into the hole to see about 30 seconds of film. In 1889, Edison went off to preside over his exhibition at the Paris Expo. When he returned, Dixon proudly directed him to look into a box where Edison saw a moving picture of Dixon, allegedly synchronized with a phonograph recording of Dixon welcoming him back from his trip. So that's the first time that Edison, or anybody for that matter, is seeing video with audio accompaniment. By most accounts, Edison was not particularly impressed, but work continued, and in 1891 he exhibited the work in progress to a typically astonished Chicago Daily Tribune reporter, whose subsequent headline read, "Light and sound united. Edison outdoes himself with the kinetograph." So I'll just say that Edison was someone who did not share his excitement about certain projects, and he really did take credit for more than he actually did. It's like kind of what I say about Elon right now. Like, if you objectively look at what he's acquired, PayPal, he did not invent, and the electric car with Tesla, Elon did not invent. He acquired the company. But speaking of Tesla, we got him at age 34 in this photograph in the book. It's from 1890. And again, it is a photo courtesy of the Library of Congress. And this photo is all over the internet. It's probably the most well-known photograph of Nikola Tesla. And at 34 years old there. All right, continuing on. Quote, from the laboratory of the wizard in Menlo Park, there is coming an invention which out Edison's Edison. Quote, he wrote, quote, with it, okay, quote, with it, the opera can be carried into the parlor. The new wonder will be called the kinetograph, a strange sounding title to the ear today, but destined to perhaps soon to be familiar as locomotive or telephone, both strange words in their infancy, end quote. He spoke of Edison as, quote, the greatest inventor of the day, end quote, and used the terms wizard and genius freely. The reporter apparently got his terms mixed up. The kinetoscope was the name given to the machine that exhibited the movies, while the kinetograph, also less commonly known as the kinograph, was the name given to Edison's motion picture camera. So basically, kinetoscope is the projector, and the kinetograph is the camera itself. The reporter described Edison's prototype as a wooden box with a hole in the top, the sign bowing and raising his hat. Like other reporters of the day, the Daily Tribune staffer immediately realized that this new device could be used to capture prize fights. When talking about the new medium, nearly every reporter of the day pondered that the device would soon record sermons, operas, and boxing matches. No one seemed to speculate that fictional narratives could also one day be produced. I'll reread that. No one seemed to speculate that fictional narratives could also one day be produced. Though most of the credit really belonged to Dixon, Edison proudly talked up the wonders of the new device. Quote, I wrote an article some years ago hinting at this very invention, quote, end quote, he said. Quote, the papers made fun of me, said I had better stop talking. This made me mad, and I determined to carry the conception to a successful issue. This I have done. Do I expect to make money out of it? Well, I have never thought of that, end quote. Here was Edison as a consummate, practiced performer, projecting the image of a rugged American individualist, determined to show the people in high places what this scrappy young fellow could do without even caring about money. Though he did privately doubt that motion pictures would ever be a big money maker, he for the Chicago Exposition. And that is the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is the Columbian Exposition. And I will be saving that for next time, because there is a lot to talk about with the Columbian Exposition. But we will keep it as focused as possible on this topic here. But so far, We are 18 pages in. It's about right where I want us to be for today. I really appreciate all you being here while we dissect all of this information. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know in the comments. And again, if you haven't already, please like this video and share it with your friends if you'd like. But I will be trying to do this every Saturday. I may not get it some Saturdays. That's just how this goes sometimes. But expect this as a consistent series, just like with Coral Castle and the Bermuda Triangle. I'll be doing this weekly, Saturdays at 11 a.m. Seems like I got a lot of you in here today, which is nice. And yeah, we kept it under 2 hours. So that's been the goal, and I really appreciate you all being here. I will have a lot more different photographs to show other than these few that I've been cycling through. But yeah, we will be having a lot of fun with this series. And I think we're going to be able to off-branch a lot from this as well. Because we already have all of these names. So the people competing to make the first motion picture camera, I'm going to have to look into more on them. But I'm really excited to be doing all of this here. And really learning together with you all. So next week we'll continue with part 2, and that will also be chapter 2 of part 1 of the book. And part 1 of the book has 3 chapters for part 1, but because of my commentary in between reading, I'm going to keep this to 1 chapter per part on here on YouTube. So that's it for today. I really hope you all have a good rest of your weekend. And again, if you haven't already, please like the video. And remember, I will be here on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4:30 p.m. Central Standard Time and 11 a.m. on Saturdays for this series. And that's also Central Standard Time, 11 a.m. And we will keep this going. We got a lot more to look through. We got other books that we can jump into anytime. But for now, we'll be sticking with Flickering Empire. And again, I recommend you picking this book up if you really are passionate about the film industry. Because it can also be a good reference book for certain things. So, that's all. I am going to end this part for today. I hope you all are doing well. Until the next one, everyone. Class dismissed.